Hi there. I'm here to talk a bit about my own personal journey with grief and my apprenticeship with sorrow and loss. And I had thought I would be writing this down for my website. I have my sort of professional biography and the kinds of work that I do and the modalities I bring into grief tending work. But I've been aware that I've not shared my more personal story of grief, loss, and sorrow. And I was feeling a bit of resistance for several months now in writing it down for the website. And I think because as an academic, I am hyper aware of how much I can control my words in writing and labor over sentence structure and grammar and um, all of the things. And in sharing verbally, um, there's a little bit more room for the messiness that is grief. Grief is not something we can tidy up and control and organize neatly. And also in grief tending circles and retreats that I facilitate, we do a lot of oral sharing of our stories in order to feel seen, heard, received, witnessed, and held. And so, without further ado, I'll dive in. I've carried a kind of unnamed sadness for much of my life. And like most of us in this culture, I have been taught that grief is connected to an acute loss, like, for example, of a person. And I still have both of my parents. I had all of four of my grandparents in my life until I was in my 30s. But as I was a young art student in undergrad and graduate school, losses made their way into my artwork, losses from undergrad. Um, I did self-portraits about my loss of self-esteem, self-confidence over the years, my struggle with my body image and my identity. And in graduate school, my losses around relationships, my marriage in particular, made their way into my work. And so now I have a name for it, my apprenticeship with sorrow, which comes from Francis Weller, my mentor. I had the good fortune to meet Martin Prechtel in graduate school. He was a friend of a professor of mine, George Kokis. They had met at the Minnesota Men's Conference with Robert Bly as a mutual friend. And he came to Eugene, Oregon, where I was doing my grad work. And it wasn't about grief. It was really to share the stories from his village, the Tutilmaya in Guatemala. And he's in exile here in New Mexico from the Civil War. And so in the sharing of these oral stories that he is preserving through publishing, there's clearly a lot of grief and loss there. But the focus wasn't necessarily on that. It was the content of the stories themselves. But there was a CD that I purchased at this talk at a local bookstore called Grief and Praise. And now you can find that on YouTube. At the time, it was a very precious CD to me, and I listened to it over and over and over. And at this point, I've probably listened to it 70 times since I first came upon that talk 20 years ago. And I just felt so strongly that I could relate to so much of what he was talking about and reflecting back what I carried, yet it didn't seem to make sense. I hadn't really experienced these big acute losses that I more identify with proper grief, the grief that comes with loss, and the kind that shatters your heart into a million pieces. Yet I carried the feeling of that. I didn't know why. And what I love about Francis Weller's work, his image of the communal hall of grief, right? That we enter through many different gates. through many different events and experiences. And when we're in that communal hall, it's not about comparison, which we like to do in our culture. We're very conditioned to compare. Oh, your loss is worse than mine. And while that may be true on some level, when we're in the communal hall, it's just not about that. It's not about comparison, whose loss is bigger or worse. It's about connection through loss, through sorrow. My first grief ritual with Frances in Bolinas, California, several years ago, I was grieving my two cats, Frida and Nietzsche, who in graduate school became a little family of three, and they were my trusted companions for 17 years, longer than any friendship. And they accompanied me through so many life transitions, and their loss was devastating to me. And I felt so grateful that in that space, I didn't have to diminish my suffering that weekend. I remember very aware of this story in undergrad when I was much younger. I also lost a cat then. Wasn't quite the same as Frida and Nietzsche, but I still felt it. And I remember getting the phone call from my father to let me know that she had been put to sleep after some repeated medical issues that apparently weren't getting cured. And I was weeping in my dorm room, and my roommate was there, and she was so concerned. I got off the phone, and with so much warmth and support in her words and in her voice, she asked me what happened. And I told her that my cat had just been put to sleep. And her response was, "Oh, that's it? I thought a family member had died." So what I love about coming to grief work is it's a safe space to share our stories and not be judged. And again, I was grateful to not have to diminish my suffering over my losses of my furry babies that weekend. And I felt so alive in the connection with others in their losses and in their grief. I'll fast forward from graduate school, and this sort of, again, this lack of awareness of what was triggering this feeling of my broken heart, my heart being in a million pieces. And this feeling that I also had since I was a very young person, of having lost someone very important to me. And again, I had no evidence of this in my biography. So on the advice of a friend, I saw a sort of a non-traditional healer of sorts. And it was my first session with her. And she identified very quickly that I was carrying so much grief. And she's actually the person who introduced me to Francis Weller's work. And after watching an interview with him and Michael Lerner, I just knew I had to work with him. And within a few weeks, I was registered for a grief ritual. So that came from that first session. But we got to talking, and this feeling that I lost someone, and this deep feeling of grief that I couldn't identify, she asked me about my lineage. And I was aware of many stories from back to my great-grandparents immigrating here from Sicily. But I hadn't made the connection until that moment. So my grandmother's mother and father immigrated here from Sicily. My grandmother was born here, but some of her siblings were born in Sicily. And it's my understanding now that my great-grandmother did not want to leave her home and her community and her family. It was the behest of my great-grandfather. So she came here with her oldest son, and apparently, as the story goes, her daughter, who I know as Aunt Sarah, they did not feel that she was strong or well enough to make the voyage on the boat. So when my Aunt Sarah was 2, my great-grandmother left for America. And as a mother, I cannot imagine the grief and the sadness at leaving my 2-year-old daughter behind. to start a life elsewhere. And so it made sense that perhaps this unidentifiable loss and deep grief and sorrow that I carry and still carry comes from her. And now we know through even scientific research and epigenetics how trauma gets passed down generation to generation. So somehow this has become mine to work with, this immense loss. And my poor great grandmother, who didn't see her daughter, my Aunt Sarah, for over 30 years. And of course, this is before Zoom and Skype and easy phone calls and texting. And she was in and out of mental institutions for much of her life and really struggled emotionally. And no wonder. I think that would make me a bit insane to carry that I left my daughter behind and started a new life and could not reclaim her. And in Francis's book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, where he breaks down the 5 gates, which you can also find online in video form, this would be the 5th gate, ancestral grief. So that felt such a relief to name and then to work with it, to metabolize this immense loss for my family and my lineage. And there were other losses connected to that, the immense poverty that they lived in. My great-grandfather got deported. And so much of this ancestral grief is, from immigration is one experience, the loss of our homes, our communities, our rituals, a feeling of displacement, which is another feeling I've carried very deeply inside of me. Like, I don't know where home is. Where I am is not home. Where is my home? Like, it's somewhere else. And this longing I've carried also suddenly makes sense in the story of my lineage. To speak to more sort of what's alive for me right now, grief-wise, much of it surrounds my daughter, who is 14 and has 2 chronic medical conditions that make her daily life very difficult. And of course, at 14, teenagers don't like limits, right? And they battle against them, and that's developmentally appropriate. But what she battles every day is the limits of her body, her energy, her capability, her capacity. And when she was little, when she was a brand new baby, she always loved to sleep with me. And we tried the bassinet and the crib, and she just was so restless. But when she was right next to me, she could sleep. And being a professional mother, the full-time job with no family here, it was difficult. I was married at the time, but I felt and continue to feel in the divorce as well that most of the caretaking for our child falls on me. So that's not abnormal in our Western culture. And I lost a lot of sleep for a long time. My daughter, she loves to move. She's a mover. She's been in gymnastics and figure skating. Now she does aerial silks, and she needs to move her body, and her body just moves even without her willing it to. And so she was very wiggly and moved a lot. And, she was like a helicopter in the bed. And being such a sensitive, light sleeper, I really struggled to get enough sleep, and had just also, as a new mother, lost many months of sleep, and it was accumulating. And so in trying to get her to sleep in her own crib, what do we do as parents these days? Like, we look to books, we look to websites and parenting gurus, and there's so many methods out there. And how the hell do we know which is right and which isn't? It's so difficult to wade through all the information. And I was at the end of my rope with having lost so much sleep. So we chose the cry out method. And I tried to follow all of the instructions where you go in and you try to soothe and reassure, but you leave the room and just nothing was working. And man, she's got such a strong will, and she would howl and scream. And one evening, when I was just so tired, I thought, I'll just really let her cry it out. And because they say this is what they need, this is what's best. Now I know better. So I went to the downstairs back room and I closed the door and I closed her door and let her cry it out. And I think she cried for about 2 hours. And I think about that and my heart breaks that I let her do that. And the next day, and I found her, it was clear by how she was sleeping that she had exhausted herself. And now, as she wrestles with an autonomic nervous system condition called POTS, and it's hard to know what the source of POTS is, but I wonder how much of that contributed, because what she needed was to feel safe, and I did not give that to her. And so her nervous system got dysregulated. So I don't know if it's a cause or one of the causes of her medical condition, but I do wonder. And when I share this story with others, so often I just hear this sort of reassurance of how we do the best we can, and I need to have compassion, and for myself, I need to have forgiveness for myself. And I do have those things. I'm very compassionate towards how limited I was and how I did not know. I didn't have mentors. I didn't have this lineage, this village of elder women and men who could hold what I was carrying and experiencing, so it wasn't all on me, and who also would have sage advice. I didn't have any of that. And I have compassion for myself with that. I still feel guilt, but in sharing this story and others from all of my parenting mistakes, which many of us have, then I don't imbue it with shame. And when we're secretive, when we hold something tight, when we don't reveal, we imbue our experiences with shame, and then we're holding those experiences in contempt, and we cannot properly grieve what we hold in contempt. So, but what I do seek is to share my grief around that. I'm not punishing myself, but I have a lot of grief around those choices. And I have a lot of grief around my daughter's suffering. Again, it's a daily struggle for her. And she just wants to live life normally with her friends and go to the mall. But if she can't be upright because it's hot and it hurts to stand and it makes her dizzy and almost pass out and it makes her sick, then she can't do those things. And she has very dark moments and days that fill me with fear and anxiety. And as a mother, I have so much grief that I can't make it better, because that's what we're supposed to do, right? As parents, I mean, we kiss the boo-boos, we make them better, but this isn't an injury on a playground, a scraped knee. And while I recognize that she is on her own journey and I just have to support her in the best way that I can, it breaks my heart every day that I don't know how to always help her, that I can't help her. And again, I'm at my capacity. I most days exceed my capacity to carry this for her and for me. And so part of my grief right now also is what Francis would identify as that fourth gate of grief. It's the loss of village. It's very isolating to have a chronically ill child, to be a single parent, managing a full-time job, and a teenager with chronic medical conditions. And so my soul is seeking that village. Where's the village that has the sage advice and the wise elders and the other parents and aunties and uncles and all the people that can help hold these challenges, like a dispersal, right? When we're one person carrying something versus 10 carrying something, right? It's not as weighty. And I will say, where I feel the best and most alive and most connected and most happy is in grief tending circles with others, sharing these stories of loss, sharing our grief, sharing our sorrows, and metabolizing them, helping one another metabolize them. We'll never be fully done with our grief. I mean, the one thing we can count on in this life is it's impermanent. So I think Francis calls the first gate of acute losses, everything we love, we will lose. And we're not meant to hold these losses ourselves. In the lineage that I'm trained in with grief tending work comes from Malidoma Some and Sobonfu Some, who came here from West Africa, Burkina Faso, the Dagara tribe. And in coming here, they could just see so clearly how much unmetabolized grief was in our culture and working on us. And so with others like Francis Weller, Lawrence Cole, Cater Brown, some of these wonderful people that I've worked with, these practices were gifted to people here who then transposed them for our Western community, because we are not Dagara people. And what I'm aware of from Malidoma and Sobonfu's village is that grief rituals are just part of the heartbeat of that community. They happen regularly. And here, not so much. Again, we have funerals for the loss of a person, and yet there's so many other losses we can name. When I think about third gate of grief, the sorrows for the world, I mean, it's hard to breathe when I start to touch into that loss of species, the loss of ecosystems. I don't know what this world is going to be for my daughter, or if she chooses to have children. And that also breaks my heart. And I've held grief tending circles with my college students, specifically around eco grief. And so many of them tell me, like, thank you for holding the space, because they want to share their breaking hearts over this planet and what's happening. And they're not met with appreciation, validation, compassion. And so yes, I'm very happy when I'm in grief tending circles with others. It's funny how people think that this work would just be so depressing. And there's a fear of grief that if we move too much into it, that it's going to just pull us too far under. But when we're in community, we're helping one another hold it. I think about like these large outstretched arms in the circle. I feel stronger when I'm in community with others doing this work, whether I'm facilitating or participating. And that's where the sister of grief comes in, gratitude, right? Francis talks about how we really must hold grief in one hand and gratitude in the other, and not be so weighed down with either one, right? If we're too much in grief, right, it's darkness. So the gratitude helps balance that out. If we're too much in gratitude, I think about like this sort of spiritual bypassing culture. We must just like think of the light and be grateful for all the things. And that's just not how I feel a lot of days. But I recognize that that's an antidote to grief, and vice versa. And Francis also talks about that, holding grief and gratitude in our hands, and then we open up and let our arms be outstretched by the grief and the gratitude. So in doing this work, we don't necessarily just move on from our losses. I think that's often impossible, but we become more expansive. And that's the metaphor that I deepen into all the time, is how am I making myself more expansive in touching into my grief and my stories of loss and my stories of suffering and sharing them with others. So thank you for listening.